Great. Well, welcome everybody to Barnyards Backyards Live. My name is Jeremiah Vardaman. I'm a extension educator for the University of Wyoming. I'm located up here out of Powell, Wyoming. Today, my co-host Jeff Edwards is having some internet trouble, so he's not going to be able to join us today. But we have two other guests with us: Barton Stam, who is an extension educator out of Thermopolis, Wyoming, covering range topics, and then Derek Scasta with the University of Wyoming Extension as well, and he is our range specialist down on campus. As always, we have Jenny Thompson, who's behind the that you can't see. She's behind the Barnyards Backyards logo. She helps us manage all the technical difficulties and everything behind the scenes. We really appreciate her. So you might hear her voice now and then as she pops in with some questions. And with that, before we get started, if you have joined us through Zoom and you got some questions, we really like to help answer those questions. That's what we're doing this for. So please throw those questions into the chat box or in the Q&A box. If you're on Facebook Live, you can type your questions in the chat box, and Jenny will be monitoring that and bringing that to us in the show here. But without further ado, let's turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about toxic plants.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Yeah, it's good to be with everybody today. So I'm Barton, and I'm in Thermopolis, Wyoming, and happy to be with everybody today.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremiah. I'm Derek. I'm down here in Laramie, based on campus, and we're excited to talk with you today. Toxic plants is something that Barton and I and other members of our Extension Range Initiative team have thought about quite a bit, and we try to be responsive to folks out in the state. So yeah, great topic and great timing.
So what about this time of year do we need to really be thinking about toxic plants?
Yeah, so, and I also want to make the clarification here that we're talking about toxic plants for livestock. If you're worried about toxic plants for yourself, Derek and I probably aren't the people to ask about.
That's a different conversation.
Yeah, it's
right?
a different one there. So livestock producers or people that own livestock really ought to be thinking about, some toxic plants or toxic scenarios year round. And there's different species that are toxic at different times of the year, or maybe they're toxic year round, but we really have concerns at more specific times of year, or there's different management options at specific times of year. So, right now we've moved into summertime. There's a lot of cattle and sheep that are sort of leaving maybe the home place or the private property and moving up into higher elevation Forest Service allotments, for instance. And so there are some species like larkspur that we're kind of just really ramping up to really be thinking about pretty hard. And there's other species maybe like death camas that we're not so concerned about for until next spring.
Right. And just for clarification, when we're mentioning livestock, we're including cattle, sheep, goats, and horses in that is usually what's defined as livestock here for Wyoming, correct?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And so Derek and I probably work mostly, not probably, for sure we work mostly with cattle and sheep producers, but also, horses and then of course goats would be a concern some too, for some species. And some of these species that we're going to talk about are going to impact, cattle differently from sheep, and for horses, we've got another set of scenarios too that we're going to be looking at.
So this time of year, we're seeing a lot of shift, right? We're shifting maybe pastures for our livestock with cows or horses, or cows and sheep. But with our horses, we might be coming out of a dry lot situation into pastures, into a grazing situation. And so that's why this is very timely in that. So I didn't mean to cut you off there, Derek. Did you have something to add?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good point, Jeremiah. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of concepts will apply to any grazing animal. So how we think about these problems, there's some common issues that we get into when we suspect we have a toxicity issue. But certainly we're talking about different species of animals that have different, at times, digestive strategies, right? So horses are cecal digesters. That's different than true ruminants like cattle and sheep. But then even small ruminants like sheep, the way they metabolize and pass through these compounds that cause problems is different. And so that's why in some cases the dosages might be different, but especially the management of their nutrition. And so when we're maybe feeding horses in a lot as opposed to running cattle and sheep on range and pasture, we might get into some different situations, but the key concepts apply to all these species. And as mammals, right, they can all be affected by some of these secondary compounds. And that's something we'll say. And secondary compounds are just sometimes that chemical in the plant that is actually the problem.
So it's not the plant itself, maybe
That's
specifically.
right.
It's maybe compounds found within it. Great.
That's right.
Well, if there's nothing else, let's get into your presentation then.
You bet. So we've got a few slides, and I'll share here. One other thing I want to say that makes this time of the year an important time of the year to be thinking about. Give me a second here. Management of toxic plants. Not only do we have things growing and maybe they're palatable, animals want to graze them, and so they're exposed after they ingest these plants, but it's also a good time of the year to kind of scout around and see, what do I have? Because a number of these plants are really showy and we can really see them pop out in the summer. And as a matter of fact, they're so showy that we were talking earlier, some people like to go collect them and put them in a bouquet and put them on the dining room table. So it's a good time to think proactively about your toxic plant management. A lot of the times that I get involved, or Barton may get involved, it's reactive. So we got dead cattle, we got dead sheep. So now we need to try to diagnose the problem. But proactive management is going to pay off better than reactive management.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I've received calls, and I think Derek has too. A lot of us extension educators receive these calls, but basically somebody's taking their horse to the vet because they're having some type of health issue and they don't know what from. And the vet comes back and says, I suspect it's a plant toxicity. You need to go figure out what they're eating. And then we get the phone call of, well, I need to identify the plants that my horse is being exposed to, either in a grazing system or in a hay. So yeah, that's usually when we get it, and that's not what we want.
And part of being proactive would be identifying the potentially poisonous plants that are on your property or on your allotments. And what Derek said about them being showy, we're looking here at a picture of a beautiful, range scene, and with the grass and shrub, and then there's that beautiful purple or blue larkspur in there. And that'll actually vary, by times of year, and also by how the precipitation is going. And unfortunately, a lot of Wyoming's in a pretty dry year right now. And so, as contrasting from last year, this larkspur may not be near as visible this year as it was last year, just because of the precip. So going on different years, and keeping in mind that some of these showy plants are going to be, more or less showier depending on the precip that occurred during the growing season. So you'll have years where this larkspur and other species like lupin will just absolutely pop on a hillside, where you got a decent amount of precip at the right times of the year. And this year it's going to be a little bit tougher to see some of those.
So, when we think about toxic plants or poisonous plants, this is a big deal in the West. It's been estimated that anywhere from 3 to 5% of livestock in the West are affected every year. And this ultimately costs a lot of money. So in 1992, there was an estimate that it cost over $300 million. And when we adjust that for inflation, we're talking in the ballpark of $600 million a year. And a lot of times, especially in livestock enterprises, we think the loss is due to death, but there's also non-lethal losses that can be problematic too. So when we have animals that are consuming some of these toxic plants, they may just be sick or unthrifty, and so performance can suffer as well. There can also be reductions in fertility and reproduction, and that can be a problem. So maybe you have a lower calf crop, lower lamb crop. So the costs associated with toxic plants is not just dead animals, it's unthrifty or low performing animals. And I think that's important concept to keep in mind.
And this can be a problem for any size of operation, right? It doesn't matter if I have 5 head of sheep or 10 head of cows, or if I have 3,000 head of sheep or 300 head of cows. We all can have this scenario. It just depends on our individual situations, correct?
Absolutely. And it even, and when you start talking about percentages, it might even hit the smaller producers harder because you have less other animals to spread those costs across.
Yeah. So if I only have 10 animals and I lose one, I've lost 10% of my operation, right? That's a significant loss to me. And especially if you are not stable on your operation, right? You might be picking up different leases or changing locations where your animals are at from year to year kind of thing. So it's not consistent. So being able to watch out for this as you acquire new grazing grounds or new land.
That's right. And especially for larger operators as we move between pastures or allotments and things like that. And we're going to talk about what we consider 5 kind of red flag or watch out situations where livestock owners would want to really be aware and pay attention. And that's one of those situations as well.
Oh, you stopped sharing. I don't know.
You bet. So, sorry, I'm clicking around here.
That's fine. I didn't know if Jenny was playing some tricks on you because she has ultimate control.
Not this time.
No, that's all me. So there's just a couple of concepts that Barton and I want to make sure that people have a good handle on, especially for this topic. And so we'll go through some of those, and some of these are kind of technical terms, but I think they're pretty straightforward. So when it comes to toxic plants, it's the dose or the dosage that we really want to pay attention to, because that is what leads to the manifestation of symptoms. Now, the dose is essentially the amount of plant consumed relative to their body weight and for how long. And so this can be highly variable across toxic plant species. Some toxic plants can cause death very rapidly. And so it's just the ingestion of a certain proportion relative to their body weight. In other cases, it can be how long they were consuming it at what rate. Now, this is a function, of course, of both amount and time. And that time, we kind of call that exposure or duration. And that leads to 2 terms that you may hear, especially if you start to talk to animal health professionals, veterinarians, and that is it an acute poisoning or a chronic poisoning? So an acute poisoning would be where there's lethal consequences after maybe just one exposure or a really short duration of time. So it's very active very quickly. Chronic poisoning takes a lot longer time. That is where, performance consequences and health consequences manifest after long periods of time of intake, and these toxins accumulate in their body. And so you want to kind of be aware of those 2 different things because that can be how that happens. And let me give you an example. So if we talk about horses, and horses, have their own management issues, there's a couple of situations we can consider. So one of those is arrowgrass, and that's a plant that grows in wetter areas and sometimes can get rolled up in hay meadows. So the toxic substance is hydrocyanic acid, and that can cause acute toxicity because it causes very rapid death. But another toxic plant that horse owners may want to be concerned about is Russian knapweed. And this is more of a chronic poisoning where these neurotoxins accumulate in the body, and they have to consume over 60% of their body weight in kind of green plant material. And over time, that's when those consequences and things occur. So acute versus chronic are 2 concepts to kind of keep in mind.
So that acute, I guess the way I think of it is acute is like a one-time shot, right? A one-time lethal dose that causes that lethal death or symptoms. Chronic is, God, you just have to be in there for a long time, and it can be accumulative. It's not I get a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit, next week, and it just starts building up in the body or in the livestock system, and then finally hits that trigger point where it starts causing symptoms and problems, maybe even death.
I would think a lot of animals, they consume various toxic plants, but they're able to excrete the toxin. And then, so the main ones to be concerned are the ones where they don't get rid of the toxin. It doesn't travel through their body and come out. It stays in there and accumulates. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So we have some species where, if they ate enough of it very quickly, it would be an acute poisoning. But they could essentially eat small portions of it over their lifetime and never experience problems. But then, like in the case that Derek put up with Russian knapweed and horses, if they're eating green material knapweed over their lifetime, it's all being cumulative and all building up even over months and years.
It's not getting digested or metabolized or excreted through the body, so it's always an accumulative effect.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the acute poisoning, it's not just one bite. It could be, several bites within minutes or hours. That could still qualify as acute poisoning. So.
That would probably be in terms of plants that are really palatable, right? Like the animal's probably going to go out, maybe seek out, or they're just in a pasture where they have no other option but to eat that plant. Is that the scenario you're kind of talking about there?
Yeah, and we're going to get into some sort of these 5 red flags as well, and we'll, or hungry, really hungry animals that are just turned out or something.
Okay.
Yeah, but Jeremiah, I think that scenario is a little independent from what we're talking about. Acute versus chronic is going to be more tied to the toxic plant substance and physiologically how it affects the animal. Those situations certainly can be magnified or reduced depending on how much grass is available as opposed to the toxic plant. But it's more of a function of the toxic compound and how it affects animal physiology, whether it's going to be an acute versus a chronic. You can think about it like this. An acute injury is if I break my neck, okay? A chronic way I might die is if I abuse alcohol and I have liver and kidney failure, okay? So you can think about it those two ways, right? Perfect, breaking my neck is a pretty quick, discrete event, right? Alcohol abuse and problems of the liver and kidney are longer term accumulated problems. So you can think about it like that as an example.
Perfect.
So let's get into these kind of 5 common scenarios that we want folks to be aware of. And there's probably others. This is probably not an exhaustive list, but certainly these are 5 situations where folks would want to really pay attention. So the first is probably one of the more common, and that is where the amount of toxic plants are much greater relative to the amount of non-toxic plants available. So here's how you can think about this. If there's adequate forage, and that's in terms of both amount and its quality, if that's available, then problems are going to be less likely. These animals, they like things that taste good. They like things that are palatable and soft and pleasant to go into their mouth. And so they're gonna search around and find those more desirable and pleasant things. But if forage is inadequate, it leads to animals changing their selection and intake, and ultimately they'll ingest less desirable plant species. And some of these species are plants they wouldn't normally eat. We were talking about milkweeds earlier. Like, why would an animal eat a milkweed? It's waxy. It has a milk substance that has aversive features. And oftentimes this is the reason we might be in a situation. So that's kind of number 1. Barton, you want to talk about number 2?
Yeah, so the number 2, new or naive animals, and this can take a number of situations. Probably the biggest one for me is, hungry animals that are all of a sudden exposed to plants. So, you can imagine yourself, if you're just starved, your selectivity is probably way down than if you're partially full. I might even eat some broccoli if I'm really hungry.
Right.
But if I'm not that hungry, it's probably going to take something like, some shrimp or some ice cream to get me to eat something. And so if you've got animals that have just been trucked in, they're hungry, they've been kept in a corral, they're going to be a lot less picky. And sort of one of these that I've seen is with, say, some sheep that are being trailed down a road, So if you can imagine, if these sheep are just crossing the road, their exposure to some poisonous plants is down to, but if they're being trailed down a road for hours and they're hungry and there's some hallage eating or something along the road, they're going to start, saying, hey, I'm hungry enough. I'm going to start eating that. The other thing with being hungry is they may not have the opportunity to mix other feeds into their rumen, particularly grasses. So we have some species that, as long as they're mixing enough grass with them, they're probably fine. But if they're just, if there's nothing else available and they're hungry, that's going to be a situation where we really got to watch out. And so if you're taking animals, and it potentially exposing them to some toxic species, one of the most important things you can do is to get them full of, like dry grass or a good quality or dry hay, and get their rumens full so they're not feeling starved.
So is it too extreme to maybe trail them to wherever you're getting to, corral them for a little bit and feed them hay, fill them up like you're saying, and then turn them out?
Yeah, those are some management strategies that each person's going to have to look at. And if you're going into, some real dangerous situations, like with some real high larkspur or hallage eating and you've got sheep, those could be some real good strategies. And they might seem expensive, at first, but when you start comparing it to the risk of dead animals, it doesn't look quite as expensive.
And that's just a good method or a good management option anyway when we're turning animals out. So if I have some horses in a corral, right, and they've been dry lotted for a long period of time, and I'm going to turn them out on green, fresh pasture, it's worthwhile not to open that gate at 6 a.m. and let them have at it. It'd be better to feed them, get them a little bit full or as full as you can, and then release them into that. And it's probably more in that scenario, more of a transition of feed. We're not talking toxicity, but it's just a good rule of thumb for any animal in a change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. You can, with cattle and sheep, you could run into some bloat issues there as well if you're transitioning from one kind of feed to another too fast.
Another aspect of this is not just hungry animals, but thirsty animals. So if they've been trucked a long distance and they're thirsty and not well hydrated, that can challenge their ability to effectively excrete, certain things in through their urine or fecal material even. So hydration is an important part of helping these animals best deal with some of these toxic compounds out there.
So this also might be a scenario where I'm buying some livestock, right? So maybe on our smaller operations or smaller acreages, our animals aren't moving those great distances like you see in those large operations, like trailing to the mountain or something. But if I buy some new sheep or buy some cows or buy horses and bring them into my operation, it'd be worth getting them in a pen where they could get a big drink of water, get them some feed before I turn them into that pasture I'm going to go to.
Yeah, that's a great management strategy for just about anything for transitioning these new animals. Is get them full on a safe, sort of benign feed before we start turning them out. And it may be a process. It may not be just a one-time thing that we do that too.
Great. So timing of green up, what do you mean with that? What's the concern there or benefit there?
So we're gonna talk about this particular species in greater detail, but different plants green up earlier or later than other plants. And so death camas is one that it's often the first thing to green up in the spring before grasses. And because of that, animals that are out there foraging around, they're looking for the green stuff and they may ingest it because of that. So you want to be aware of that. And if you have a high density of death camas, I've been on some country down here where we have it, it's not super dense. So they'd really have to work hard to ingest it. But understanding that some species that are toxic, they're the first thing to green up. And that's why animals eat them, is because everything else is still dormant.
And so it doesn't matter what plant you're talking about. When they're first greening up, when they're first new growth, active growth, they're probably the most palatable that plant's going to be. They're going to have really high end of nutrients, really a lot of vitamins in them, and that's what makes them desirable. Is that correct?
That is a good general rule of thumb. There are some exceptions, but what I often say is maturity is the enemy of quality. So as plants mature, their palatability goes down, their fiber content goes up, and they're just less desirable. Now, there's a few exceptions, especially in the suite of toxic plants that we'll talk about. But yeah, that's a okay generalization. Barton, looked like you were gonna.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it is a good generalization, but yeah, there's some very important exceptions to that rule. So.
Nothing's cut and dry, right? Especially when we're talking about toxic plants.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And so the other thing,
go ahead, Bart.
The other thing I was going to say is that, you know, we talk about forage quality and we also talk about palatability, and sometimes we use them interchangeably, and they're not necessarily interchangeable. So, I mean, you could have a plant that is full of good stuff, protein, carbohydrates, but that also has these secondary compounds or high fiber or high lignin content that make them, you know, so there is lots of good stuff in there, but there's also some stuff that decreases the palatability. So the
palatability essentially is an animal's ability to palate that, right? He wants to taste that. He wants to eat that.
Wants to eat it.
How soft and supple it is for that animal's mouth to consume. And if it's a really coarse, it could even be a grass, right? But if it's a coarse, hard plant, the palatability is not there, and he's gonna, if he has the option, or the animal's gonna have the option to choose something else, they would.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. We don't want to confuse that language there. So yeah.
So the fourth scenario is what we kind of call addiction or habituation situations. And an example here is loco weeds. Loco weeds are often in the genus Astragalus or Oxytropis. And oftentimes these secondary compounds can cause kind of this preference for them. It's not always exactly an addiction, but it's kind of similar to that. So some common compounds that can cause this are alkaloids. Now, all of us know about alkaloids because we're familiar with some common alkaloids that are addictive to humans. And here's two examples. Caffeine in coffee and nicotine in tobacco are both alkaloids. And we know that humans can become quite addicted to those substances, and they can be hard to quit. And in the same way, animals can sometimes become attached to those certain plants, and it may also be the taste associated with those. So those situations can happen as well. And then the final one's weather and timing. I'll kick that over to Barton.
Yeah, so this one, you know, and we're going to talk about in more specifically nitrate and prussic acid poisoning, but when you have, you know, certain weather events, like, you know, anytime that basically plant photosynthesis shuts down, that plant is going to stop metabolizing certain substances. And so nitrate and prussic acid are going to be some of those. So if you think about, you know, a drought or even an early frost, or in some, you know, really bad situations, a bad run of really cloudy days, those kind of things can start to cause problems in certain forage species that we'll get to in greater detail here in a little bit. But, you know, it's not just a matter of, you know, drought is certainly one, and that's usually the one we think about the most, but there's other events that we really need to be careful of. And if we have some of those species that have a tendency to contribute to nitrate or prussic acid poisoning, we really got to watch and do some testing.
Well, and you'll probably cover it once we talk about nitrates, but it's a kind of a stress to that plant can induce like that accumulation of those toxic compounds, right?
In nitrate poisoning, the plant is always pulling up nitrites from the soil. But as long as photosynthesis is occurring, it's converting those compounds onto amino acids. But as soon as photosynthesis stops, then those nitrites just keep building up in the plant, and the plant isn't able to metabolize them, so they accumulate there. And then if you have an animal come along and eat them, that's when you start to have issues.
Great. So those scenarios play off of each other, correct? They're not independent. They're intertwined. And when we got to think of all of those as we're trying to address any concerns of toxic plants in our area.
Yeah, you could have combinations of these scenarios. Certainly, you could have 2 or 3 of these coinciding, and then that could create problematic situations.
Great. So what's next then? What else do we need to understand?
So we just want to reemphasize that understanding what you have, what you're grazing, and what species are there is important. And now's the time to do that. If you do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this seminar, get out there and try to understand and learn the plants that you have on your place that might be problematic. That's the big takeaway, is try to become more proactive and know what you have on your place.
So if I am not very savvy in understanding plants and not able to identify them, what resources or what connections can I have to try and to do a better job of understanding that?
There's lots of resources out there. The thing about toxic plants is you can have a variety of them, but you're probably not going to have more than a few. And so learning what they are shouldn't be too intimidating. And Derek and I are always willing to help folks with plants. And there's a number of other resources. There's even apps now that are you can put on your phone that are really pretty user friendly for identifying poisonous plants. We've got a publication that we're going to be sharing here that's from these guys, this lab that's up on the screen right now. And then if nothing else fails, if someone wants to pick some plants or even send photos, there's a couple of producers that I work with that are always sending me photos of plants and asking me to help identify them. So a little bit of effort can go a long way towards identifying some of those species, and we're happy to try to help with it. The one thing I will say is if you're collecting plants to show somebody, either collect them and preserve them or get it done quick, and don't throw it on the dashboard of your pickup for the 3 weeks and then ask me to come identify it. So.
Yeah, no, those are good points. And if you are going to bring in a sample, you want to get as much of that plant as possible. Yeah. You don't want just a leaf or a blade of grass or the inflorescence or flower. You want some of the roots. Thing. You want as much as you can get. But other resources I think of, Barton talked about extension. We're here. We have an extension office in every county. We'll talk about it later. But bring them to us and we can get it to people that's what they're trained in, is identifying plants. Good, clear pictures help, right? The other thing is our local weed and pest office. They do a very good job at IDing plants as well. And we also help each other with that ID. So, yeah. So what's this lab about?
Yeah, so this is another resource that I think folks should be really aware of. So the Department of Agriculture has this poisonous plant lab, and it's actually not too far away from us here in Wyoming. It's just over the line in Logan, Utah. And they can assist with verifying toxic plants. At times, they can possibly assist with some other lab work. And so I think it's an important kind of a high-level resource that has a lot of people that this is all they do, and they do some really cool research. As a matter of fact, we're hoping to work with them on some larkspur grazing research in northwest Wyoming. At the bottom here, there's this link, and this is a PDF to a book that I think is a must-have. So it's this book here. It's Plants Poisonous to Livestock in the Western States. It's kind of a nice concise book. It doesn't overload you with overly technical information, but it includes both maps and pictures. And so this is a book that I kind of keep handy myself, and you can download it for free. I think they will send you some possibly as well. So that's a book that you should grab. Looks like Jenny has it linked up there too. So she just put that up. So.
Yeah, and we'll throw it on the Barnyards Backyards website where we post the recordings of this as well, so people can access that later. But no, that looks like a really good book. Good photos, good information, very concise. Yeah.
It's an outstanding resource for like Derek said, Derek and I both refer to that book all the time, and it's very producer friendly. It's one of the top, 5 or 10 you ought to have. So.
If you have livestock, you better have the book.
Yep. So we're going to look at a number of plants. We'll show you a few pictures that we could get into now if you guys wanted to.
Yeah, that'd be a good way to go.
All right, let me see if I can get a screen share here. So these are just kind of the plant species that Barton and I have, had the most questions about, and we want to talk about the most. So the first is called death camas. I'll just show you two pictures here. On the right, you can see this is that early green up, and this is a plant that it greens up before everything else, and you can see it. There's some native grass down here on the left. It's barely starting to go, but that's why animals will consume death camas. And here's what it looks like. A lot of people will think it looks like a native onion or something like that. And we talked about human toxicity, and certainly I'm not the professional in that area, but this is a plant that people have confused for wild onions and have died themselves. So this is a plant that will kill you as easily as it will kill your livestock. So if that is something you like to do, be very careful if you suspect you have death camas where you're foraging around.
And this was pretty common in Wyoming, correct?
It is. Yep. It is common across Wyoming. You can see it's actually common across the western United States. So there's a map there. So this can be a relatively quickly acting toxic plant. It has steroidal alkaloids. And when we talk about dose, a sheep would only have to graze maybe 1/2 pound to 2 pounds of green foliage relative to 100 pounds of body weight. And if they did that, death can occur within a few hours to a few days. Now, there's a bunch of symptoms that I've put here, and these are from the book that we mentioned, the ARS book. A really common symptom is this kind of salivation or frothing from the mouth. It's kind of that aversive reaction they might have. But in this case, weakness, staggering animals, an irregular pulse can be something. Ultimately, for death camas, there's heart failure, congestion of the lungs and kidneys. Now, one of the things about death camas is there's really no known treatment. Now, some individual animals may recover on their own, but because there's no known treatment, we really want to manage this with our grazing management, and that is to avoid infested areas, especially during that fickle springtime when we're hoping for some warm temperatures and precip to green up. We want to avoid those areas. So this is something you might want to scout around for and just be aware of.
This is more March, April time period, depending on where you're located in the state.
Yep, this is definitely those spring months.
So now, looking at your slide here, the symptoms that you show, can these symptoms be confused with anything else? Or is it like, oh, yep, that's toxicity. I know it was death camas.
Well, this is a little bit different than what you asked, but the thing that always sort of cracks me up about the symptoms from poisonous plants is like they're all the same, right? I mean, you not exactly, but when you're a livestock producer and you're looking at an animal that's been poisoned, it almost doesn't matter the species. I mean, they're just so similar. So, and I'd probably have to talk to a veterinarian if there were some other conditions, but that can cause a lot of these. But you'll get froth coming out of their mouth under bloat or something too, which could also be from some poisoning issues. But
yeah, so you're right, Jeremiah. Barton's right. An animal that's about to die is going to be weak. It's going to be staggering. It's going to have a hard time breathing. So it doesn't matter what it ate sometimes. Some of these are more important for a necropsy or the surgical examination of an animal after it has died. So you could determine it had congested lungs and kidneys. You could examine the necrosis of muscles and things like that. So the symptoms, in some cases, there are very specific symptoms. We'll talk about a few for some other species, but some of them are pretty general, and they're just indicators that if you knew you had death camas and you saw these symptoms, you can start to connect the dots. So it's more for an awareness that, hey, I might be having some problems. You'll find guides that'll have these charts with all these symptoms, and for something like weakness, many of these toxic plants cause weak and staggering animals.
Right. But maybe would it be too far to say that possible diseases or that can also cause that staggering or weakness? And so it's not a trigger in your mind to say, oh, it's death camas poisoning or even a toxic plant. There could be other components that create similar symptoms in certain cases. or is it toxicity plants are unique versus diseases?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. I mean,
Gotta put you on
diseases
the spot, Derek. Can't
and
give you the easy ones.
and epidemiology. I mean, diagnosing those, certainly there are specific ways to diagnose those things. And I think if you were suspected of having a disease, you're looking at a different suite of testing and things like that. So, you're going to be looking for antibodies, relative to exposure to a virus, for example. Now, an unthrifty animal, right, may cause you to question, do I have a disease or do I have some kind of toxicity exposure? And you may not know. And there could be potentially just general unthriftiness in both kind of general scenarios. So yeah, hard to say. You can't overgeneralize that.
Well, but it's probably left up to getting help from a professional, taking it to a vet and getting their perspective on it as much as you can. You can correlate, like you said before, but needing that expertise to help you narrow that down and give you a good definitive answer as best they can.
Yeah, and I'll also say that if you've got animals dying, I'm frequently called in to come and look for poisonous plants because animals are dying. And I think sometimes if the cause of death isn't immediately apparent, like it was hit by a car or killed by a bear, poisonous plant is one of those places where it seems like producers immediately look for is, that it must have been a poisonous plant. And in some cases it obviously is, but there are many causes for why livestock die, and it's not always poisonous plants. And in some cases it can just be, like Derek said, an unthrifty animal or an old animal that's just not getting adequate nutrition, and it's not always just a poisonous plant.
Great.
Yeah, so the relationship with veterinarian services would really be important, both on the front end and the back end of trying to be proactive or reactive. And so we have private veterinarians, of course, serving throughout the state. We also have the Wyoming Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, and they have a necropsy floor. So if you had an animal, you could probably coordinate with a local vet, and you could determine how to get samples to the lab here in Laramie. And then the necropsy report's going to be greatly detailed. I mean, they're going to use the latest technology to look at tissues and other things to determine what was the cause of death. And determining the cause of death is a more complex endeavor than we might suspect. So certainly, like Barton, like death by grizzly bear is pretty straightforward, but an unthrifty animal that had a slow decline can have a lot of other symptoms and issues. So getting exactly to the cause is more complex than maybe we sometimes understand. So yeah, veterinarian would be an important resource to talk with about these things.
Well, and that I think I appreciate that you brought that up, Derek. The state vet lab is what they call it down there in Laramie, and it's another resource for people to reach out to and get other information on their animals, and especially with toxic plants. They're going to have resources as well, and they probably coincide and work with that lab over in Logan, Utah. And so it's a big network that we try and share with everybody and help address their questions and answers. So.
And like Derek was, the cause of death, even when we're sending samples to the lab, it can still be tricky. Like, I mean, if you're sending the right sample, I mean, they can almost for sure tell you that, yes, this animal ate larkspur. Could we definitively tell you that larkspur was the cause of death? Maybe, but maybe not, So there are it's not as straightforward as sometimes it appears, but there is lots of good information that comes from it.
Great. So there's limitations in the system. Yeah. Always is. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. And that's a good point. We've done some diet studies where we know animals are picking up some of these species in their diets, and they're probably not dying. So it goes back to that dose rate, the relative availability of other forages. So like Barton said, yeah, they may have eaten it, but they're going to then look at some other things. And let me show you an example here. Next example is a good one. So halogeton is a plant of concern in Wyoming. It's a pretty easy to identify plant. It's got this characteristic red stem. It's fleshy, and it has this characteristic hair right here on the end. And you can see its distribution in the map here. More than its geographic distribution, you want to know that it's really in disturbed areas, roadsides, right-of-ways, railroad, things like that. And the toxic compound is sodium oxalate, and this accumulates as plants mature, so they're going to be getting more toxic as they get older. And ultimately, this precipitates calcium from the blood, which causes damage to the kidneys and the rumen wall and interferes with energy metabolism. This is another one of those pretty rapid acting toxic plants. The losses are most common to sheep. When you look at this map, there's a lot of sheep winter range down here in southern Wyoming. So that's why that's part of the problem. But we can see losses in fall, winter, and early spring. It doesn't take much, 12 to 18 ounces per animal. But when you look at these symptoms, and we were talking about symptoms earlier, right? Weakness, well, we know that's a symptom for a lot. Reluctance to move, rapid shallow breathing. But there's some other things that we could measure to see if these animals fall within the reference ranges for some of their blood hematology workups. So one of the symptoms is hypocalcemia, and that's low blood calcium. There's also uremia, which is increased nitrogenous compounds that normally are excreted. They're waste compounds. So we can measure those things to confirm a diagnosis of halogeton. But if you knew you were trailing sheep in southern Wyoming down an old road that had a bunch of halogeton, you could possibly suspect that might be the cause. Now, there's no known treatments for halogeton poisoning. So again, we're going to manage this with our animal management. We're going to avoid those infested areas if we have to go through them. We want to provide some supplementation and offset the amount of intake. And we may also think about range improvements to just try to either control or reduce the amount of halogeton on the landscape.
Great.
And one of the things about halogeton is if this is one that if they're able to mix a lot of grass with their diet with the halogeton, then they can tolerate a little bit more halogeton than they can if they're just eating 100 eating 100% halogeton. So grass is high in calcium. So if that's the reason why if they're getting a lot of grass, they can handle more halogeton.
Is that fairly consistent with most toxic plants? I know there's always probably going to be an exception or that, but if they can have, just like we talked about, filling up those hungry animals before they're turned out, but if they have availability to more or other, especially grasses, that can help offset some of these toxic plants, right?
I would say, yeah, for some, I would say it depends on the species we're talking about.
And that's why we need to know what plants we have in the area that we're at, because it does depend. Perfect. So what's the next one?
So the next one is called pine needle abortion. And this is most common with ponderosa pine, particularly in the eastern part of the state. Throughout the western plains as well, we'll have these issues. So what pine needles can cause is essentially abortion in cattle. And this occurs when cattle in their last trimester have been ingesting pine needles. So there's these abortifacient compounds, these abortion-causing compounds. And these are acids, and isocupressic acid is the primary one. And so the symptoms are that abortion can occur within 48 hours after ingestion or up to 2 weeks later. And ultimately, this can lead to weak parturition contractions, excessive hemorrhage from the uterus, and then ultimately the cervix doesn't dilate. If the calf is not completely aborted and it's born alive, it might be small or weak. And that female, she may have insufficient milk, so they can be undernourished or malnourished in those early lactation periods. In addition to losing calves because they were aborted or they died the first couple weeks, the mature females can retain their placenta, and you can lose some mature cows. So consultation with a veterinarian, especially if it's suspected that she's retained her placenta, would be important. So you'd want to move quickly on that if you were in this situation. And then really avoiding access to pine trees during that last trimester is important. So whenever your calving period is, you would want to manage that way.
Especially around ponderosa pines. So some of us, like I'm thinking the Bighorn Basin here, a lot of us in the Bighorn Basin, we don't have pine trees. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have a lot of ponderosa pine in the area as well. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. And so, I've talked with some producers in the eastern part of the state. This is a big issue for them. And they had a couple of years where they had a significant reduction in their calf crop. And so this is a big part of their management plan, is managing pine needle abortion.
Great.
So the next one we're going to talk about is larkspur. This is a big deal, probably one of the most widespread plants. I'll let Barton get started on that.
Yeah, the larkspur it's huge. It's by far the most common. The most common poisonous plant issue that I deal with, and in fact, the larkspur species are responsible for more cattle deaths in the United States than any other poisonous plant. So it's a native to Wyoming. There's several varieties. It's a beautiful plant. You might even find it in someone's flower bed somewhere. So the genus is Delphinium. And sometimes you actually hear delphinium being used as sort of a common name, like, my grandmother has delphiniums in her flower bed. There's the tall larkspur, which has some different management techniques for poisoning than say the low larkspur. And the tall larkspur is going to be this very robust, big plant that grows at higher elevations, like in wet or wetter meadows, versus the low larkspur that you might see, it might only be a few inches tall in a dry year, and it's going to be growing, amongst the sagebrush and even the prickly pear. The toxic compound in the larkspur is alkaloids. Probably the biggest problem with larkspur is there are certain times of year where cattle just want to eat larkspur. It's palatable. They like it. It has some good forage quality components to it as well. So here we're looking at this chart, and this is relative to the tall larkspur species. So we go from left to right along the x-axis, and that's our time. So we're starting out early, where the plant is very young and small, going along towards the right to maturity. And then on the y-axis, from bottom to top, is increasing toxicity. So what we have there is that toxic window, and you can see as we move along in time, the toxicity is declining. At the same time the toxicity is declining, the palatability is increasing. So this is one of those very important exceptions to that rule we talked about earlier, where palatability is actually higher as the plant is more mature. So where that toxic window is sort of where the toxicity is still high enough and the palatability has increased enough that the animals want to eat it. And so depending on, where you are elevation wise or aspect, if it's a southern facing slope, this could probably be anytime from sometime in June, and we've seen it over in western Wyoming clear into, late summer, where that toxic window is. So for grazing larkspur, we really want to try some avoidance techniques from these toxic windows. And so before you get to that toxic window is a really low risk window, and we even have it labeled there. Unfortunately, that's usually for where a lot of tall larkspur grows. That's kind of tough to graze those high elevation zones early, much before mid to late June in a lot of places. So if you can wait and graze those tall larkspur areas later on when the toxicity is pretty low, if that's a management technique. A couple issues that we also see with larkspur is people want, if it's on private ground or somewhere else where you're able to spray it. So this is one of those where if you spray it with a herbicide, what happens is the palatability increases, but the toxicity does not change. And this it's also where you've now killed the plant. So any toxins that are in that plant are going to stay in that plant. And I have warned producers about this that wanted to spray it on private ground, and they went ahead and sprayed it, and then the larkspur was dead and laying on the ground and still killed cattle. So it is something to take very seriously if you're going to be treating larkspur with herbicides. And even like an increase in humidity, say from a thunder shower or just a foggy day, seems to increase the palatability of tall larkspur in some cases enough to get animals to start eating it.
That's crazy. That
Yeah.
that seems like a very difficult plant. If you have it, a very difficult plant to manage around, and avoidance almost seems to be your only alternative.
It is. It's really a tough one. The other problem that I've seen happen is there are some mineral mixes that are created by certain companies that actually encourage you to place the mineral in the larkspur stand, because their mineral is so great that if the cows are eating their mineral, they won't want to eat larkspur. I would strenuously disagree with that advice, and I would do anything that I could to avoid attracting my cattle to larkspur zones.
Well, that seems like a really, I mean, that seems kind of like a no-brainer. Why would you want to take a mineral, which is an attractant to your animals, right, and put it in a patch of toxic plants, right?
Right.
But common sense tells us we shouldn't probably do that.
Right. But I have seen the material from the people that make it that say to do that. So don't do it.
Sounds good.
So here we've got a couple pictures. These are actually the big one on the right is from way up in the Bighorns, and there's a couple species in there. There's actually lupin, which we'll talk about, and then there's also larkspur. The picture on the lower left you'll see is a low larkspur that I took, and it actually starts to green up very early in the spring too. Maybe not, probably not quite as early as death camas, but pretty soon. And you can see that there's some dormant leftover grass where I took that photo. And then the one in the upper left is again some low larkspur that's basically at full maturity or full flower stage actually. Low larkspur is a little bit different than the tall larkspur for management techniques. That toxic window that we talked about with the tall larkspur is not really a relative strategy for low larkspur. Where you really want to worry about with low larkspur is if you have these real high dense patches of it. So, if you're seeing 5, 6, 7, 8 plants, in a square yard out there, that's getting to be those high dense zones where an animal could basically not have to travel very far at all and get several mouthfuls of it and start to die or start to have issues pretty quickly.
We got a question for you guys. Anna asks, would mechanical removal on, say, less than 20 acres be better than herbicide spraying in the fall to rid of larkspur?
Are we talking like farming it, like plowing something up, or?
I'm guessing like mowing would be my suspect, but I'm not really sure. It would decrease it. You'd also, if you were mowing it, you'd also be wiping out your other forage species too. And, of course, so would, like plowing or disking. So that might, mowing it might reduce the above ground biomass for that year, but you're not going to be doing anything in the long term to kill that plant. She just clarified and asked, digging with a shovel, like in a horse pasture area.
Yeah, so that's digging with a shovel. You're targeting a specific plant, and if you can do that, that's obviously going to remove it. You're probably not going to do a lot though for long-term kill on like wiping it out for multiple years. I think it'll start to come back more. This is not usually one that we worry about a ton for horses. We see our biggest losses in larkspur with cattle. So sheep can actually tolerate a lot more larkspur than can cattle relative to their body size. And if you have the opportunity to do some multi-species grazing, grazing an area with sheep first that has larkspur in it is a legitimate strategy before putting cattle in there. If I had an area, relative back to I think Anna's question, if I had an area, a small area that I felt like I could treat, some of that digging would be okay. But if I could control the access to the grazing in there, and I wasn't opposed to using some chemicals, doing some spot treatments of those specific plants with some chemicals, as long as I could control the grazing afterwards for that year, would be another management strategy as well. And I realize that there's some people that don't want to use herbicides, and so that wouldn't work very well for them.
Well, and I think mechanical removal could be an option. The one thing that jumps out to me on the question is I don't think I'd want to be doing that in the fall necessarily, because the plant at that point has probably set seed already, has already reproduced in that pasture. And so I'm not doing any physical, you're doing a lot of work, a lot of exercise out there, right? But we're not doing any benefit to removing that plant from the pasture, so to speak. And so if you were going to go to that effort, I think you'd want some more gain for your efforts, and probably want to dig that in the flower stage if you were going to do that, to keep it from reproducing to seeds and hopefully keep it from spreading within the pasture.
That's a good point, and it would also apply for the chemical control too, is to do it earlier in the year as well. So a couple of interesting things that come up with larkspur is there actually is a class of drugs that you can get from your veterinarian, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but it's neostigmine or neostigmine, that can be used for treating larkspur poisoning. I will probably let you consult with your veterinarian before I get myself in too much more trouble with advising its use. I think it's pretty expensive to use, but you'll have to weigh that against a dead animal. The other things that I've heard about and actually witnessed with my own eyes is there's a bit of a, I don't know if you want to call it a wives' tale, but there's an old sort of a cowboy treatment that if you cut the tail vein on a cow that's been poisoned by larkspur, that she'll get better. And I have seen it done. And I've seen those animals get up and walk away after it was done. But the veterinarians and all the literature will basically tell you that there is zero veterinarian or scientific evidence that actually helps. And that if you did cut the tail vein on an animal and they got up and walked away and recovered, that they would have recovered anyway. So I am a little bit reluctant to argue against these cowboy treatments, but there's really no scientific evidence that works. But it's out there, so we usually try to mention it.
Great.
The other thing with this one, when they're dying from larkspur poisoning, they are dying basically from organ failure, and particularly their diaphragm. So they're not able to breathe right. And so if you, for instance, come across a cow out in the open and you suspect larkspur poisoning, and you rope her or you trail her to a squeeze chute, I mean, what are you doing? You're increasing the stress on an animal who already can't breathe. And so you really have to be careful in weighing how much treatment you want to do, and are you actually going to be making the situation worse?
Gotcha.
Sometimes one of the best situations, if you can, like if they're already down, if you can get them up in a more natural bedding position, posture or position, and then just leave them alone, that might be a good strategy. It would certainly be better than if they're laying on their side all spread out, because they have even a harder time breathing than normal in that situation.
Great.
So one other thing I wanted to mention is that with larkspur, there's a difference in how it affects, say, sheep versus cattle. So cattle are very susceptible. Sheep are less susceptible. Matter of fact, it takes a 4 times greater dosage to cause negative effects on sheep. And so there's been some evidence, anecdotal, that sheep grazing followed by cattle grazing can be a good strategy. So if you're able to do multi-species grazing, that's a way you could reduce the larkspur prior to cattle coming on and probably not suffer too many negative effects, because that earlier grazing would also be outside of that more toxic period that Barton described.
Great. What's next?
So we've got a few other species we wanted to point out. So lupins are also common throughout Wyoming. Just kind of a picture there for you.
You'll
If
need to
any of
share
you
it out.
say again.
You'll need to share it out. We can't see it yet. Here, Lupin.
While you're getting that pulled up, the picture behind me is actually a picture up on the mountain of lupin behind me. So again, another very much like larkspur, very showy, pretty flower. We were talking earlier that, yeah, people are cutting them and putting them in cut flower vases at home and things like that. So yeah, very attractive, showy flower.
Yep, very attractive and showy. The issues usually occur when we have hungry animals that are allowed to graze lupin, or if we have a high component of it that was rolled up in some hay. Alkaloids are, again, the toxic substance, and this plant's dangerous all times of the year, from when growth starts all the way through till dry down. Here's some dosages for you. So cattle that consume anywhere from 1 to 12 pounds of lupin without other forage, or smaller amounts consumed daily for anywhere 3 to 7 days consecutively, can cause problems. There's a bunch of symptoms similar to some of the symptoms we've been talking about: nervousness, salivation and frothing, depression, reluctance to move, lethargic, difficulty breathing. This muscle twitching in the legs and convulsions is a little more of a unique symptom that we don't see as much. And then the outcome that we can see is what we call crooked calf syndrome. And these calves can be born with deformed palates and legs. And so you may not see as many problems in the female cow, but in her calf, you can see some of these problems. And this would occur when ingestion coincides with this 40 to 70, sometimes you reach 40 to 100 days of the gestational period. So.
Well, and one thing I think Barton pointed out with the larkspur in particular, but I think with lupin as well, and we talked about it earlier before the show, this is something really important to pay attention to any seed mixes you're wanting to do. Barton mentioned that larkspur, sometimes known as delphiniums, can be found in flower beds and that. So knowing what is in your seed packages, right? These are native plants. It's possible they could show up in a native seed mix. I think, Derek, you mentioned that some lupin has been showing up in some roadside reclamation seed mixes. And so
it might not just be roadside ones, but it can be, like after a burn, if the Forest Service is planting, you could easily find lupin or larkspur in some of those as well.
And so just being aware of that, right, when you're purchasing a seed mix, even if it's for an ornamental flower bed or something, just knowing what is in that seed package before you plant it. If you don't know of them, look them up. If you're curious about that plant toxicity, or if there is a potential, reference that book. I mean, that's kind of how this can go, but they can be spread into areas where they most likely might not be suspected or found, or where we don't want them, and we intentionally plant them as well.
Yep. So the final thing Barton and I wanted to point out was nitrate and prussic acid accumulation and poisoning. So nitrate poisoning is typically a problem in warm season grass hays, although there's some other species. So oat hay, oats are a cool season grass, can sometimes have these problems. And then things like beets, kochia, and pigweed. Nitrate poisoning, you want to watch out, especially if you have the onset of hot and dry conditions in these kind of hay meadows, hay fields. There's some levels of nitrate, so you can get these tested. And I don't know, Barton, if extension educators in Wyoming provide this service of testing. I think some private labs do. But then you can see the level of nitrate in parts per million and what's safe and the potential effects. So if you get some discount sorghum Sudan hay, you may want to ask a few questions about the growing conditions it came out of, or was it tested?
What species of animals does nitrate poisoning tend to affect?
Mostly cattle and sheep. Yeah. For it to impact horses, it would have to be extremely high. I mean, way into the danger zone for cattle. But one thing I like to tell people with nitrate poisoning is the only way to tell whether these species for sure have unsafe levels is to have it tested. And one of the labs that I work with, the test costs all of $7. So it is really easy to test for. and I don't have the ability to test it out in the field, but sending it off to a lab for $7 is a really cheap and easy situation. And you can have a wreck overnight with cattle or sheep, just because you had the wrong environmental or even the wrong fertilizing situation in your soils, and you could have gone years with no problem, and all of a sudden have just the wrong conditions and have be killing multiple cattle or sheep overnight.
And here's where this situation can coincide with kind of broader drivers. If we go into a drought scenario, people may start bailing up stuff that they normally wouldn't bail up. So in some places I've been, you might get some grain sorghum stalks that get bailed up and sold, or other things. So when we go into a drought where we have reduced hay resources, sometimes we're bailing up and feeding or selling things that are less than ideal. So the conditions can induce the problem, but they can also induce us to feed a bunch of stuff maybe we need to think twice about or test before we feed.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I would even say I've experienced up here in the Bighorn Basin. So, and it's probably more particular to the Northwest, that we do see some nitrate poisoning in grazing of irrigated cool season pastures as well. And again, that's a management issue. That's probably not very common for most of the state of Wyoming because we don't have that much irrigated acreage being grazed, but you can see it in that fashion. But I see it more commonly in the hays that you're talking about. And even I see it in cereal hays, so barley, wheat hay, oat hay, millet hay, those type of hays as well. Even though they're not a warm season grass, they're cool season grasses, but we still see those nitrate toxicities. And it doesn't always have to occur in a stress period for the plant. It might just be a harvesting time period could also induce that nitrate toxicity.
Yeah, if I was going to feed any of those species that are up there or that Jeremiah just mentioned, if I was going to feed any of them, I would just not until I had a nitrate test done. There's just no excuse for not doing, and that's pretty common. I help some producers that are maybe selling a bunch of oat hay, or someone's buying a truckload of oat hay to test for it. It's really not a big deal, and most of the producers of those species are probably they might already be doing it themselves, and they'll have it ready to provide to a buyer. So it really isn't a big deal to have it done, but it's a big deal that you need to have it done.
Be aware of it. You can manage around this. Definitely. Yeah. And in terms of resources, Derek, you talked about extension educators here in Wyoming. We don't have the capability of testing for nitrates. However, we can help you in understanding of how to sample. A lot of the offices have what are called hay probes, and so you can core out that hay to sample to send off to a laboratory. And then we have laboratories that we can recommend to you to send off and get those analysis done. And like Barton said, it's $7. It's pretty minimal expense, but it'll save you a ton in the end. And then once you get the results back, we're also here to help you interpret those results and trying to manage that hay if it is hot. So it's not I have to get rid of that hay. There are some management strategies just depending on what those levels come in at.
Yeah, if you have something that's moderately high, it's pretty easy to mix it with another feed and make it perfectly suitable for feeding, especially to certain classes of animals.
Dilute it.
Yep. Great.
So finally, prussic acid, similar kind of way to think about it. Mostly warm season grass species. And typically this is associated with kind of an early frost, early freezing temperatures, and the cyanide potential associated with it. And you can see there's a list of species here. So again, if these are things you're buying, feeding, producing, pay attention to that.
Right. What else, guys?
So I think we may have covered just about everything. Let me glance back here. Yeah, I just think awareness of what species you have, proactive, scouting pastures and range is important. discussing with your veterinarian what's common in my area, developing that relationship beforehand. And then if you do have a problem, again, necropsy and those things to really identify the cause are important. So download that book from the Poisonous Plant Lab. That's an important resource for you.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you guys' time. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing all this good information. I don't have any other questions. Do you have any questions on your side, Jenny?
No, more had comments. I wanted to share a couple of things that we have online. So Derek was talking about resources as far as finding information on poisonous plants. So if you go to that Barnyards and Backyards website and you go down here and click on forage, pastures, and grazing, there's a section that we have that's on feeding hay, watering, and poisonous plants. And if you go under other publications, this is a direct link to that book that he was showing you. So you can pull that right up and look at it. We have another link there that will take you to the website where that is housed, which has a lot of great information on individual plants. So if there's plants that we didn't cover today that you have questions on, you can see this whole list of arrowgrass, rubberweed, chokecherry, and so on. You can click on any of those and pull up information about individual plants to get some more information.
Great. We have a question again from Anna. Any tips for managing loco weed?
So is that to kill loco weed or grazer? I mean,
just management around it. Is there options of killing it? Are there options? I think previously we talked about you just need to avoid it for the most part. But anything, all the above. But I'd imagine for a control method.
Yeah, so one of the things about loco weeds is they can be pretty palatable, and so animals can develop a preference for that. And so you want to watch out for that if they just seem to really be camping out on it and grazing it. So your grazing management relative to your time, and then some kind of integrated management strategies could be important. So some kind of improvement of the range.
And I would say looking at your livestock's diet. So, are they getting adequate protein supplementation? And then if you want to look at controlling the loco weed, I'd probably be looking at, some chemical treatments while it's actively growing.
Okay. And that would be primarily for a private land situation. If you're on a public grazing, you definitely need to work with that public entity, maybe BLM, Forest Service, state, whatever, before you just go out and start spraying anything. Yeah. So, but on private land, you have the option. You can control whatever. However, if you're in a rangeland situation and you spray that pasture, you're not going to only kill that plant. You're going to kill other broadleaf plants with that herbicide treatment if you did that route.
Unless you did if it was a small enough area and you could do a spot treatment. Yeah.
Right.
Like with a backpacker or four-wheeler sprayer.
Specifically just spray those plants and nothing else.
Right.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, and the problem with treatment on public grazing allotments is a lot of these plants are native. And Barton and I have sat in rooms and had these conversations, and sometimes it is an absolute no. That is not an option. Although it seems like I've heard some discussion about maybe there is some leeway on some allotments. I don't know how much has been done. So yeah, talk with your range management specialist about what are my options. Is there any possibility?
Great.
And maybe, and when you do that, I'm not saying you'll get a better answer, but sometimes it takes a little more probing than just sometimes we actually have to look in the forest plan and see what the actual rules are. Cause Derek and I have just been totally shut down on one forest, and then on another forest we've had, we can do that. So, it varies.
Doesn't hurt to ask, right? Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us again. Thank you for your time. This has been an excellent show as always. Appreciate it. And with that, we want to just show you again, we have a a few resources that we talked about going through the program. So the first one that Jenny has pulled up here is, if you need to connect with us, if you need help IDing plants or help with the testing of hay or have further questions, reach out to your local extension office. We have an extension office in every county and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And so reach out to us at that URL, real easy to get to us. The other thing is, we mentioned the Barnyards and Backyards website. I think most of you know that. Probably been there. We are keeping a current list of these Barnyards and Backyards live shows on there, a schedule of what we have coming up. So look into that. Also, shows like this one, we've recorded them. We're going to slightly edit them and put them back up on the website so you can watch them later or share them with friends. Also, the links and references that we share throughout the show, we try and put there as well. So it's a one-stop shop for you to click, find those resources, and move on with life. And then what we have here is, what do you got here, Jenny? Is this Wyoming?
For folks that are looking for help identifying plants and controlling plants on their places, the Wyoming Weed and Pest offices, as was mentioned before, are a great place to go, as well as Extension. So you can just pull up their website and find out where your local weed and pest office is. And the conservation district, some of them also provide some information as far as helping identify plants or getting you to folks who can.
And all of those resources, the weed and pest, extension, conservation districts, we're all here to help you and serve you. And so if you need help improving your pastures, right, that's a part of that strategy of being proactive with toxic plants, is improving that forage and improving that range condition. Contact those people can help you as well with that. The last thing is evaluations. We always need help. Here with UW Extension, we need your help to understand how we can better focus this program, and we'd like you, if you have some time, to provide and share your feedback on the show. So if you're on Facebook, Jenny has thrown that link into the comments section. Same here on Zoom in the chat box. She shared that link. If you're on Zoom and you close out, you'll be prompted in an internet browser with that evaluation. It helps guide us. It helps us know what to offer for you, but it also helps us answer back to our stakeholders, our supervisors, to say what we're doing and that this is a worthwhile cause for you. With that, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, guys, for taking your time out of the day and joining us. And we will see you next week with our next show.
Thanks, guys.